January 11th, 1944. 24,000 feet over Oschersleben, Germany. I remember the V12 engine running at maximum manifold pressure, a deep vibration you feel right down in your spine before your ears even register the noise. The wind scraped across the freezing plexiglass, and the tight cockpit smelled like rancid sweat, damp rubber, and cordite. Through oil-smeared glass, Major James Howard watched the 401st Bomb Group getting torn apart. Heavy jagged metal rained down from the sky. A swarm of 30 German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, circled the American bombers like sharks smelling blood. Howard's radio sat silent. The rest of the escort had scattered in the severe weather. Standard doctrine dictated an immediate retreat. Instead, he pushed the throttle forward to the stop. The Merlin engine coughed a puff of black smoke, caught its rhythm, and he pushed the nose down into a vertical dive, straight into the center of the German hive. They will tell you the math of aerial combat is cold and exact. 1 fighter against 30 is a guaranteed death sentence. I am going to explain the exact physics of how one single aircraft survived that math without being reduced to vapor in the first 60 seconds. You will see the mechanical detail that caused the Mustang's weapons to fail right in the middle of the heaviest action. And you will understand the suicide bluff maneuver that broke the Luftwaffe formations and saved hundreds of American bomber crewmen. Understanding what happened up there requires knowing how an engine, a wing, and a desperate man operate when the safe options disappear. If you want the version of this war that they do not put in standard history textbooks, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The instinct to run when outnumbered 30-1 is baked into human DNA. Howard had to fight that biological urge while managing a machine that required constant, precise physical inputs. At 24,000 feet, the air temperature read -40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to crack the leather on sheepskin flight boots. He was isolated, staring at a wall of 20mm cannons that could shred a heavy bomber in 3 seconds. He made the conscious choice to ignore the survival manuals. He armed his 4 50-caliber machine guns and selected a target. The men in those bombers were trapped in aluminum tubes, hoping the escort they were promised would show up. How do you protect a heavy bomber formation when you are the only fighter left? Howard pushed the nose down, building the kinetic energy he would need to stay alive. Back in early 1944, the 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers at an unsustainable rate. Our daylight missions resulted in massive losses because the standard fighters lacked the fuel capacity to escort the heavy bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and make it back. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this limitation. They simply loitered out of range, waiting for the American fighters to hit their fuel limits and turn for home, then moved in for the kill. The introduction of the P-51B model changed the geometry of the air war. Fitted with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it finally possessed the endurance to go the distance. The 354th Fighter Group was the first to take these new machines into combat. But the airplane could only do so much if the weather refused to cooperate, and the European winter was a relentless enemy. The morning of January 11th began in heavy London fog. Taking off meant trusting your instruments while hoping you did not collide with another aircraft hidden in the dense soup. Formations tried to assemble over the North Sea, but the freezing clouds and poor visibility broke our escort squadrons into scattered fragments. By the time the bombers approached the target zone over Oschersleben, the fighter screen was practically non-existent. The German radar controllers saw the fractured escort and vectored their interceptors to exploit the gap. Howard had lost his wingman in the blinding clouds during the climb. When he finally broke through the cloud ceiling into the harsh, unfiltered, high-altitude sunlight, he found himself entirely alone. The radio crackled with heavy static, offering zero contact with friendly fighters. The isolation in a single-seat fighter under those conditions is a physical weight pressing on your chest. Below him, the situation was coming apart. Howard spotted the combat box of the 401st Bomb Group enduring a coordinated slaughter. White contrails carved sharp lines across the frigid blue sky, tracing the deadly paths of the interceptors. The German fighters employed frontal assault tactics, hitting the B-17s where their defensive fire was the weakest. He watched the distinct flash of high-explosive shells impacting aluminum wings. Debris and smoke trailed from the heavy bombers as they fought to hold their rigid formations. Howard knew the crews inside were enduring freezing temperatures and relentless incoming fire. He had less than 10 seconds to decide his course of action before the bombers suffered another fatal pass. He checked his 6 o'clock position, verified he was clear, and committed to the dive. The Mustang's airframe groaned as the speed climbed past 400 miles per hour. Engaging that many hostiles broke every tactical rule we were taught, but the math was about to collect. He picked out a twin-engine Messerschmitt 110. The German pilot was locked onto the tail of a struggling B-17, focused entirely on his gun sight. Howard dropped out of the sun, using the glare to mask his approach. He waited until the gray wings of the enemy fighter filled his windshield ring. He squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The heavy vibration of the .50 calibers shook the entire airframe. The burst was short, maybe 2 seconds, but the convergence was perfect. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds stitched across the German fuselage. The bimotor erupted into a bright orange torch and fell away from the bomber formation. It was a clean kill, but the bright tracers and the burning wreckage acted like a flare, signaling his exact position. The hive reacted instantly. A dozen Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts abandoned their attack runs on the heavy bombers and pivoted toward the lone American fighter. They saw a single target and recognized an easy kill. The radio chatter among the German pilots must have been chaotic as they scrambled to align their gun sights on the intruder. Howard was now facing a wall of enemy aircraft, all carrying cannons designed to tear heavy bombers into scrap metal. He did not attempt to match their horizontal turns. Instead, he pulled back hard on the stick. The G-forces slammed him down into his seat as he converted his 600 km/h dive speed into a steep vertical climb. The 2-stage supercharged Merlin engine dragged the Mustang up into the thin air, leaving the heavier German fighters struggling to follow his aggressive ascent. He bought himself altitude, the most valuable currency in a fight. The physics of a 30-to-1 engagement dictate that you cannot stay in front of their guns for more than a fraction of a second. Howard understood that survival meant constant motion and managing his energy state. He reached the top of his climb, rolled the aircraft inverted, and pulled back through the horizon to locate the next threat. The sky was filled with dark silhouettes turning to track him. He picked a target, pushed the nose down, and let gravity add to the power of the V12 engine. The Mustang shrieked as it accelerated back into the fight. He fired a quick deflection burst at a crossing Focke-Wulf, saw strikes on the wing route, and immediately pulled away before the enemy's wingman could establish a firing solution. He was fighting a defensive war using purely offensive maneuvers. People think historical dogfights resembled a medieval joust, 2 pilots turning in a beautiful, endless carousel until one proved his superior skill. Let me correct that right now. Trying to enter a sustained turning fight against 30 enemies guarantees a quick death. The geometry is simple. You follow one enemy through a turn, and his wingman simply slides into your blind spot and shoots you in the back. Survival relies strictly on vertical tactics. You dive in straight, take your shot, and use your momentum to regain altitude fast. You never expose your tail by slowing down to turn with them. You strike and climb. The reality is about energy management, altitude, and striking before the enemy realizes you are in range. I want to know what you actually thought a dogfight was before you heard this. Drop it in the comments. Howard's machine was built for this specific type of vertical combat. The Mustang retained its speed in a dive exceptionally well, and that speed translated directly into rapid altitude gain. He did not waste time swirling around in horizontal circles. He dropped tens of thousands of feet, slashing through the German attack lines at nearly 650 km/h. Seeing a P-51 screaming through their peripheral vision on a collision course forced the Luftwaffe pilots to react instinctively. They jerked their flight controls to avoid the incoming fighter, which immediately broke their steady flight paths and ruined their aiming solutions on the bombers. Howard was resetting the board every time he made a pass. He would dive, disrupt the formation, climb back to the sun, and repeat the process. The engine screamed under the constant stress of full-power climbs. The physical toll of this maneuver is heavy. Pulling out of a high-speed dive generates 5 to 7 times the force of gravity. That pressure drains the blood straight out of your head and pools it in your legs. Your vision narrows down to a dark tunnel, and if you hold the pull too long, the world goes entirely black. Howard's skeleton took the weight of a small car, pressing him into the metal seat bottom every time he hauled back on the stick. He repeated this violent physical cycle for minutes on end, fighting the loss of consciousness while tracking multiple targets in a three-dimensional space. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the sub-zero temperature of the cockpit. He was operating purely on adrenaline and muscle memory, reading the airspeed indicator and the engine temperature gauges through a gray haze. The Mustang was a brilliant machine, but the early B models carried a severe design flaw hidden inside the wings. To fit the heavy .50 caliber machine guns into the thin wing profile, the weapons had to be mounted at a sharp angle. The ammunition belts fed into the breeches through curved metal chutes. Under normal straight flight, the system worked well enough. But under the heavy gravitational loads of combat maneuvering, those metal belts twisted and bound up inside the chutes. The mechanical stress of a 6G pull transferred directly into the firing mechanism. While Howard was pulling maximum Gs to evade the swarm, the ammunition belts in his wings were fighting a losing battle against the physics of the tight turns. He lined up his next shot on a German fighter and pressed the trigger. The response was not a heavy roar. The trigger yielded a dry metallic clack that you could feel right through the grip of the control stick. 3 of the 4 M2 Brownings jammed instantly. Howard reached down and manually charged the system, pulling the heavy metal handles to clear the breaches. He pressed the trigger again. The air filled with that same sickening dry snap. The severe G-forces had twisted the belts permanently. Only the single inboard gun on his right wing continued to fire. He was facing over 24 heavily armed interceptors with a 75% reduction in his own firepower. He had a fractured escort, 0 radio support, and now a broken weapon system. He engaged another fighter using just that one working gun, holding the trigger until the final rounds left the barrel and the belt ran dry. What happens next took less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that changed the rules of the air war. The Mustang was now essentially a fast metal glider with a V12 engine, entirely incapable of inflicting bullet damage. Howard glanced at his fuel gauges. The main tank was dropping fast toward the reserve line. He had 0 ammunition and fading fuel. He possessed the perfect, legally justified alibi to roll over, push the nose down, and run for the English Channel. No commander in the world would court-martial a pilot for leaving a 30-to-1 fight with empty guns. But he looked out the canopy and saw the B-17s still trudging through the kill zone. The German fighters were reforming, sensing the American fighter had lost its bite. Howard pushed the throttle forward. He was not leaving. He decided to use the mass of his aircraft and the psychology of his enemies. What happens when you bring an empty gun to a cannon fight? The true test of nerves was about to begin. To shoot down a heavy bomber, a Messerschmitt 109 pilot requires 3 to 5 seconds of stable, level flight on the exact same line as the target. They suffer from target fixation, tunneling their vision through the glowing ring of their gun sights. Howard knew this mechanical limitation. A line of single-engine German fighters was forming up to execute a frontal pass against the exposed bomber box. In a split second of calculated risk, Howard initiated a head-on attack. He pulled the nose of his empty Mustang around and pointed the spinner directly at the pointed nose of the lead German fighter. He was initiating a game of high-altitude chicken against an opponent holding all the ammunition. He pushed the throttle wide open and closed the distance. The closure rate of 2 opposing fighters at combat speed exceeds 1,000 kilometers per hour. The German pilot saw the silver nose of the Mustang expanding rapidly in his windscreen. The Messerschmitt's nose flashed with bright yellow fire as its 20-millimeter cannons sent heavy lead shells tearing through the space between them. Howard's Mustang remained entirely silent, not returning a single round. The cockpit shook violently with the aerodynamic wash, but Howard held the control stick dead center. He refused to yield an inch of airspace. He kept the nose pointed directly at the cockpit glass of the enemy fighter. He was offering a double suicide, betting his life that the German pilot wanted to live more than he wanted to kill a bomber. At 300 meters, the physical details of the enemy aircraft became starkly visible. The exhaust stains on the cowling, the spinning blur of the propeller blades. The distance vanished in a heartbeat. Human instinct took control of the German pilot. The sheer psychological pressure of an incoming silent fighter refusing to divert broke his nerve. The Luftwaffe pilot yanked his control stick hard back and to the right, abandoning his stable firing platform to avoid the mid-air collision. The heavy maneuver threw his aim wildly off target, sending his cannon shells harmlessly into the empty sky. By breaking formation, the lead German fighter forced his wingmen to scatter to avoid hitting him. The entire coordinated attack fell apart in a matter of seconds. Howard blew past the dispersed German fighters, having successfully protected the bombers without firing a single bullet. He used the Mustang's retained energy to climb back up and prepare to do it again. He replaced firepower with sheer presence, using the immediate threat of a ramming attack to disrupt their lines. Howard kept up this empty bluff for another 15 long minutes. He made pass after pass, diving aggressively at any German fighter that attempted to line up on the B-17s. He forced evasive actions, scattered formations, and created continuous chaos among the interceptors. Eventually, the low-fuel warning light illuminated on his instrument panel. He had pushed the engine and his own luck to the final edge of the envelope. But the Luftwaffe pilots were also fighting their own mechanical limits. Facing the same fuel exhaustion and frustrated by the relentless interference of the lone Mustang, the German commander ordered a retreat. The enemy fighters rolled away, diving back toward their airfields in the east. The sky over Oschersleben suddenly emptied. The chaotic roar of combat faded, replaced by the steady, smooth, and placid hum of the Merlin engine pulling through the thin air. He banked the Mustang gently, scanning the horizon to ensure the German fighters were actually gone. The 401st Bomb Group flew on in tight formation, their path ahead finally clear of interceptors. Howard pulled his oxygen mask away from his face, wiping the cold sweat that had gathered under the tight rubber seal. His hands gripped the control stick lightly now, the adrenaline draining from his system and leaving a deep, heavy exhaustion in his muscles. He adjusted his mixture controls to lean out the fuel flow, setting course for the long drag back to England. The trip across the North Sea was quiet. He tracked the needles on his fuel gauges, watching them bounce near the empty pegs as the English coast finally appeared through the lower clouds. He aligned his Mustang with the runway at Royal Air Force Station Boxted and dropped his landing gear. The tires hit the tarmac and the engine idled down as he taxied to his hardstand. Howard cut the mixture and the big four-bladed propeller spun to a halt. When he pushed the canopy back, his hands were shaking so much he had to grip the sweat-stained canopy rail just to steady himself. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, expecting to find the machine shot to pieces. Mechanics ran their hands over the aluminum skin, checking the wings, the tail, and the engine cowling. They found exactly one bullet hole in the right wing. One single strike after 30 minutes of continuous combat against 36 enemy fighters. Howard climbed down from the wing root and filled out a highly modest post-action report, treating the engagement with bureaucratic dryness. He claimed 3 confirmed kills, noting the mechanical failures of his guns without any dramatic embellishment. The true scope of what happened over Oschersleben only surfaced days later. The bomber commanders of the 401st began filing frantic reports about a lone cowboy in a P-51 who had single-handedly kept a massive German fighter force away from their formation. They confirmed that not a single B-17 under his immediate protection fell that day. The physical cost to Howard's body went unrecorded in his paperwork, but the skeletal ache of enduring heavy gravitational loads for 30 straight minutes requires weeks of recovery. The mission proved something vital to the high command. General Jimmy Doolittle used this exact engagement to solidify his new tactical doctrine: release the fighters. Escorts would no longer fly chained to the slow bombers. They were ordered to push forward, hunt the Luftwaffe on their own terms, and clear the airspace before the bombers even arrived. The engineering problems Howard faced that day directly shaped the future of the air war. The twisting ammunition belts in the early Mustang models forced designers to overhaul the wing structure, standing the guns upright in the legendary P-51D model. But it was the B model, flown by a man willing to bet his life on a silent bluff, that proved the concept. Major James Howard received the Medal of Honor for his 30 minutes over Germany, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to earn that distinction. He turned a machine built for escort into a weapon of psychological dominance. He showed us that when the guns fail, the pilot remains the most lethal component in the cockpit. If this story deserved to be told, make sure someone else gets to hear it. Share this, and keep the history alive.